Okay, so last rule for the discernment of spirits, and this is the second set of rules. So there are two sets, 1 through 14. Is for those who are just entering in to the spiritual exercises or in the beginning way they're a beginner on the purgative way. But somebody who's passed beyond that, they're in the illuminative way, they're proficients. This is appropriate to them. In other words, the devil's not going to just tempt them with things of the senses. He's going to tempt them with things connatural to someone who is moving forward in their spiritual life, which means that they might very well give consolations, but try with a tendency. The tendency isn't always seen right off the front end. We see the tendency only in examination post hoc, when we start to see that it starts to shift. And for that reason, post hoc, we can look back and we can learn something about our enemy. And we have some security against this if we have general dispositions of always trying to start with self-knowledge, beginning and ending of our prayers, that we examine ourselves regularly, that's daily, and that we entrust ourselves to Our Lady. So with those things in mind, we can look at rule number 8, which, all honesty, we're not going to have a whole lot of new practical advice here. Though we do need to comment on it because much ink has been spilt over rule number 8, which says, granted that when consolation is without preceding cause, it has no deception in it, since, as has been said, such consolation is from God our Lord alone. Nevertheless, a spiritual person to whom God gives such consolation should, with great alertness and attention, examine his experience to discern the precise time of the actual consolation without preceding cause, as distinct from the following time, in which the person is still glowing and still graced by the residue of consolation that is now over with. The reason for making this distinction is that frequently in this second period, either through one's own reasoning about the relations of concepts and judgments and the conclusions to be drawn from them, or through the influence of a good spirit or of an evil spirit, various purposes and opinions take shape, which are not given immediately by God our Lord. Inasmuch as that is the case, these presuppose these purposes and opinions are in need of a prolonged and careful examination before full assent is given to them, or they are put into execution. So, context. These rules are good at all times, but as we're praying and as we're doing these things, and if you're in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, you might have inspirations to do something, to make decisions. And a way that something could get in the way of that is false consolations that are urging us in the wrong direction. Now, here, this idea of without preceding cause. Again, what that means is that one isn't just meditating, they're not meditating on the life of Christ, they're not thinking of a theological concept that then leads them into consolation. That's pretty much what everything in the exercises are designed to do. But you could just be sweeping, you'd be doing something, and all of a sudden you're overcome and you're enraptured in, or that you're brought into the love of God. Now, there's no deception in that. The devil can't do that. He can't move directly in the soul like that. He's got to do it in some sort of mediated way. So if he's causing a consolation, it will be with preceding cause. God does that, the devil does that. But the difference, again, is the directionality. The tree is known by its fruit. That's what a lot of these other rules have been about. But with this one, at the very beginning, we talked about consolation without preceding cause. Now we're coming back to it and rounding it all off and saying that, sure, granted, this consolation without preceding cause can be from God, but once it's over, there could be an afterglow where your thoughts enter back in, or temptations enter in, and it kind of jumps on the tail end of the consolation and tries to act like it's coming from the consolation, like this was the counsel, when really the counsel would have been within the consolation itself. So it's important to be able to track even these consolations without preceding cause, at the beginning, middle, and end, to see that there isn't any deception in a thought that's coming forth from it. Now, a bit of commentary from Jules Toner. He says, interestingly, he says that the problem is with this, that our grasp of what Ignatius means by consolation without previous cause is so incomplete that we cannot with any reasonable assurance recognize when we have or do not have such an experience and put the rule into practice. So it's hard to put this rule number 8 into actual practice. When does consolation without previous cause begin? When does it end? Maybe when you're experiencing it, you'd know. But it's tough to make a rule from this kind of a priori. There are too many conflicting opinions without convincing reasons for any of them. So a lot of commentators, they don't all agree. There are too many unresolved questions, the answers to which are needed in order to make a sound judgment whether or not some particular spiritual consolation is what Ignatius means by consolation without previous cause. Here's Toner's solution. Here's the practical advice. If in our reflection on spiritual experience we simply subject all consolations and all thoughts that seem to come in genuinely spiritual consolation, whether or with or without previous cause, to the test already described, right? So just take them through the regular criteria, we would be just as safe from deception as we would ever be with the thorough knowledge of what Ignatius means by his distinction of consolation with and without previous cause. So take them through rule number 5, the same criteria, just examine yourself. And so examination, again, this is the practical piece. We need to go through and really examine ourselves. So I will end with the advice of St. Anthony of the Desert. Let us examine ourselves, our own selves, and hasten to fill up that which we are lacking. And as a safeguard against sin, let the following be observed. Let us each one note and write down our actions and the impulses of our soul as though we were going to relate them to one another. So I highly urge, foster that humility, true devotion to Mary, daily examine, and you'll be pretty solid. And familiarizing yourselves with these rules can be very helpful. But again, be careful not to become a spiritual hypochondriac. Good is good and should tend to good. If you're growing in faith, hope, and love, then you're moving in the right direction. If you're moving the other direction, then correct. Right? So at that, I'll leave you to listen to all of these things again as necessary. Google, if you will, Ignatian Rules for Discernment of Spirits, and I would highly urge at some point doing a spiritual exercise, a retreat, 3 days, 8 days, 30 days, in life, whatever it might be, and get a good spiritual director to guide you through these things as much as you can. And again, qualify good spiritual director, somebody who is going to be teaching in line with the church and placing everything within that criteria. So I hope this was helpful to you. It was fun to make. And I'd love to hear any kind of feedback you might have for these sets of rules or other things you would like to hear about within the spiritual tradition. God bless you, and happy hunting.